In this video, I'm going to install and use some version control software. The type of version control I'm going to install is called Git. I think that if you're watching these videos, you probably already know, at least at a basic level, what Git is. The Git website is git-scm.com. And on this website, they've got some excellent documentation. If you want to learn Git, they have an entire book about Git available for free. What I would recommend most people do is look at the videos here about Git right on their documentation page. Look at the first 3 videos. What is version control? What is Git? And get going with Git. Those 3 videos will teach you the basic commands I'm going to show you here. And then you can just look at the documentation for a few of the other pointers that you need to use Git. But if you're just an individual developer using Git, I think that you can work in a very simple way, and this doesn't really add any complexity to your process and gives you a lot of benefits. Now, I'm personally very familiar with version control, and I'm also very familiar with GitHub that I'll talk about later in this video. But I'm sort of going through it here the way that somebody who's learning it for the first time would probably want to go through it. The first thing I need to do is install Git, and it's been a long time since I installed Git. Fortunately, I don't need to install Git in Ubuntu Linux. It should already be here. So if I start up a terminal window, I guess I need to install Git. I think this is the minimal installation I installed on a virtual machine, which is why Git didn't come with it. If you have a desktop Linux, you probably already have Git installed. And if you have Windows or Mac, you just go to the Git website downloads page and get the actual downloads you need and the instructions on how to install it. There, Git is installed now. Now let's actually use it. In my previous videos, I was working on a program or a project called UserMapper. That was in a directory I created called UserMapper. So I'll switch over to that directory. And you can see here's all the code that is in the directory. Now, to make this code a Git repository so that Git can keep track of all the changes I make, I just have to be inside this directory and then run the git init command. Let's have a look. One thing I see already is this PyCache folder. And I don't want Git to be tracking all the changes in that folder. It can get quite large, that folder, which means all this information gets stored in the metadata that's in the Git repository. And when I get to the point where I'm using a remote repository like GitHub, this would be synced up with the cloud. I don't want that. And Git has a feature that lets you specify which files and folders you don't want it to track in a repository, because while you're working, you'll get lots of extra files created, usually when you're trying to run the program, that you don't necessarily consider to be really part of the project. It's called the git ignore file, and I just need to create it using a text editor. The contents of the git ignore file are really simple. I just need to list specifically the names of the files and folders that I want to ignore. There, that tells it, please ignore everything in PyCache. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to ignore the output file because that's going to potentially change every time I run the program. And I don't need Git keeping track of that. And that's everything. So I should just be able to save this file in the UserMapper directory and call it .gitignore. It's essentially a hidden file. There you can see the hidden gitignore file, and you can see the .git folder that Git created when I initialized this repository. Now that we've made that change, let's have a look at the status. Git status. We can see that Git doesn't list the PyCache folder here, so it's not tracking it at all. Next, I need to commit my files into the Git database. First, I need to stage them, And to stage them, I use the git add command. This adds them to a list of files that will be submitted into the database in the next commit message. So it's git add and then dot for the current directory. Here the status shows everything is staged and ready to be committed. And so I can commit it with the git commit command. And when you enter in the git commit command, you can add a descriptive message that explains exactly what you're doing. And in this case, it will just be first commit. The other thing I need to do is initialize some of the global variables that Git will use. And at a minimum, it needs my user email and my name. Now that we've initialized those simple variables, let's try to commit my first commit again. 5 files have been committed to Git. Now that's like a tag. I can always come back to this point in time where these files existed in this way. And this is the way version control works. I'm not going to try to explain it here. Those Git videos I pointed you to do a much better job of explaining how version control works if you're not familiar with version control. Eventually, I want to use a graphical user interface for Git or the Git plugin that comes with the VS Code text editor. But before I do that, I just want to refresh my memory about what all the Git commands that I usually use do. So let's review how Git manages changes to files. Here, for example, is my mapperdata.py file. And let's say I change all the IP addresses so that they're on the 30 subnet for this lab. And I remove student 4 from the list of students. And I save that. If I come back here and do a git status, I can see that I have one modified file that needs to be committed. So I can do a git add or just a straight git commit with the -a command. So that's what I'll do. I'm just moving forward here. In the master branch of Git, I'm going to do a git commit -a -m. There, now if I do a git status, everything's fine, and a git log will show me what all my changes have been. So I have my first commit and my second commit. Now I'm working straight in the master branch here, and that's fine, I guess. There's other ways to do this, but if you're in the master branch and you've decided that at some point you need to go back to sometime before you made the change, you can do that using the reset command with the hard option. And you have to use the hash that identifies the specific commit. So if I know for sure I want to go right back to my first commit, maybe I started working on this for a while and I really messed it up and I want to go right back to the beginning, I can type git reset hard. Now if I go back to mapper data, it says, oh, that's been changed on the disk. So I'll reload it and boom, you can see I've got my student 4 back and I've got my IP addresses back. And I only have the first commit left. Now, when you're working in the master branch, I do not recommend working only in the master branch. Anybody who's working with you can't really work with you that way. So what most people do when they're using version control and when they're using Git is when they want to make changes, they create a new branch that branches off from where the code is today. So you still have the main branch with no changes in it in the master branch, or I guess it's the main branch now. And then you start doing all your edits in this new branch you've created. And if you like all your changes, you would merge them back with the main branch. This is how we'll do all of our changes going forward. This way, when you're in the middle of your changes and if you decide things are going bad and you just want to go back to the beginning, just delete that branch and then start a new branch from the main branch. That way you're not always looking back through all your commits and trying to figure out which one do you need to go back to. Just step out of that branch that you messed up and start over again. So first, let's just quickly put back the changes that I originally wanted to have in here, because I want to have a second commit in here just to make this a good example. Okay, and now I will create a new branch. So the command is git branch, and I'll just call this new branch. And then I'm going to switch over to that branch. I'm going to make Git work in that branch. So by default, all of the changes I make and everything will be tracked in this new branch. And that command is git checkout, the name of the branch that you just created. See, it tells me I'm working on new branch, which came from main. Now let's make some changes. First things first, I don't need this temp.py file anymore, so I'm going to remove it. And I'm going to make more changes to the mapperdata.py file. I'm going to change those IP addresses again. So that's all I'm going to do in this branch. I'll save that file. Git status shows me what's going on. I've modified one file and deleted another, and Git has made a note of that in this branch. So I will now commit these changes to the branch. Oh, I need to add them first, of course. So I've made those changes. Now, just to show you what's going on between the branches, I have two branches here. Now, if I list this directory, I can see that that temp.py file has been deleted, and these changes over here in mapperdata.py are still there. But if I switch back to the main branch, if I go git checkout, and in this version of Git, it's still called master, I've switched back here. So if I go back to mapperdata.py, it's been modified behind the scenes. I reload it, boom, there's the old version. And if I go back here, I can see temp.py is back. Now I'll go back to my new branch. And you can see, again, this has been changed back to what was the changes I made. And that temp file is now gone because that's what exists in this new branch. And I can see the branches that exist with the git branch command. So I see master and new branch. And there's a little star next to the currently active branch. Let's see what the git log looks like. Now to merge this change back to the main branch, I need to first go back to the main branch. So I'll go git. And then I merge the new branch back to the main branch. So look what it's done here. It has changed two files in the main branch and has taken those in from the new branch. And if you look at this log here, what it's basically saying is that the master branch and the new branch are the same. And now I'm going to delete the new branch because I don't need it anymore. The branch delete command is git branch -d for delete and the branch name. We can see that our directory has the temp.py file missing and that the mapperdata.py file is exactly what we expect it to be. So we've made those changes. We can see there's only one branch now, the master branch. That's everything I want to show you about basic Git at this point. Next, we'll add a remote repository based on the publicly available GitHub server, which is a web service that we need to explore a little bit because it adds some additional functionality that's going to be handy for collaborating with other people and also just for keeping track of, I suppose you might call it, the story of your development. GitHub is relatively easy to use. They provide very good documentation. And they offer a series of videos on YouTube on how to use GitHub. And I really recommend the Get Up and Running playlist. Working through this will reinforce some of the Git information that we've already looked at and also shows how to use GitHub. And it starts off from the point of view of the individual developer, like me, and then gradually builds up towards collaboration. So I think that's a really good way to get into using GitHub. So first you'll need to create an account in GitHub. I already have one, so I will sign in. I don't need to sign up. And you can see since I've already been using GitHub, I already have a few repositories that I've forked, and you don't need to know anything about that yet. So I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to click on the new repository button, and I'm going to give it the name user mapper. I'll give it a short description. Because I already have a local repository, I'm not going to add a README file or a .gitignore file just yet. I will choose a license. I'm going to make this open source and then create the repository. So that creates a file called license that's going to sit in the repository for people to see. And that means that there's something here that I'm going to need to pull down to my repository to sync everything up, as well as I've got my local code that I need to push up to this repository. My local Git repo needs to know the URL of the remote Git repo here on GitHub in order to push code to it or to pull code down from it. To get that URL, click on the code download button, which will show you either the HTTPS URL, the SSH, or the GitHub CLI command to use. And you can see that it gives you a copy that. And then we'll go back to our Git command line and we'll add this to our Git repo here. This is the local Git repo again, and I'm going to add a remote location. I'm going to call it origin. That's the simple name that people usually give to their remote repository. You could call it anything you want. I'm just following the normal Git convention here. And then the actual URL. And let's see if that works. Let's check it. So I see that origin has been created, and we'll use the verbose tag to see everything about it. Okay, so for fetch and push operations, we're going to this particular remote URL. This is the remote Git repo that this folder is using. So let's push the main branch to the remote repository. So push to the remote repository that I've named origin, push the main branch. And enter in my GitHub credentials. Well, I guess since I've already created this license file up there, it doesn't want to push anything up until I first sync up with the remote repository. Yeah, so nothing got sent up. I need to do a git pull first to pull down the license file, and then I can push everything up. I shouldn't have created that license file in the first place. So if you're following along, and if you've gotten to this point, sorry, otherwise skip the license step. You can always add one in later. I have a merge conflict here, which has prevented that license file from being integrated into my local Git directory. As you can see, it's not there yet. What's happening here is I have two master branches and they're conflicting. One thing about Git is sometimes things do get confusing when you have these conflicts, and you usually have to dig into the documentation to resolve them. If you're working in a simple way, you'll probably never run into things like this. Because I know I've got totally separate files in each directory, one way to solve this is to do a git pull with the rebase option. Okay, so the rebase is actually what worked this time. I'm not an expert in Git, and this can be one of the things that gets people a little bit worried about using Git, is running into problems like this. But you can usually find a quick recipe to fix it just by searching Stack Overflow or something like this. And once we start using the graphical user interfaces for Git, especially, for example, using the plugins that come along with the VS Code text editor, we'll probably not run into these problems anymore. Now, having synced up my local repository, I want to push everything up to the top. So I'm going to do a git push. This should take everything that's in my local repository and send it up to the user mapper repository in GitHub. For now, I have to keep entering my credentials, but there's other ways to do this so that I can use keys and not have to enter in my password every time. So let's refresh the screen here and see what's been sent up. So now both repositories are synced up, and I could do something, for example, now to add a README to this code. And the README is just sort of like a little web page, and it's written in Markdown. That's something you can look up, the markdown syntax, a very simple markup language. The pound sign means title, 2 pound signs mean a second level title, and so on. And that's usually all people need to know when you're writing a README. And you can preview what your README will look like. There, looks pretty professional. So we'll scroll down and we'll say commit new file. We'll commit that directly to the master branch. Great, so now there's a commit up there that does not correspond to what's down on my local repository. And this is a little bit like collaborating with people. I'm probably getting ahead of myself here because I'm not collaborating with anyone really. If you change something up here on GitHub, you then need to bring it back down to your local repository. Let's see if I can remember how to do that. I could do a git pull from the origin remote repository to the main branch. Okay, so now this time a normal git pull works, or it should work. There you can see the README file has come down. And that's because we're now sort of operating the way Git expects us to work. There's been an extra commit up on user mapper, and git pull brought it down. And there was no conflict with respect to the pointers it's using and things like that. I'm ready to get back to modifying my user mapper program. My goal is to make it a little bit more flexible and maybe to accept a configuration file as an input instead of hard coding all of the data into dictionaries. I'll be doing this while I'm supported by the Git version control system so that I can have confidence that if I ever get to a point where I think I need to take a few steps back and start from some earlier version of my code, I'm able to do that. And also everything I create will be backed up on the GitHub remote repository. Thank you for listening.